Everybody, welcome to the Friday of our Travel Unity Summit 2021, the last day of our virtual sessions. So this morning, we're going to get into really more core kind of DEI concepts. A lot of the stuff we've had in the past couple days has been around identities and sectors and communities. This is a much broader kind of scope for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So before we get into that, I want to remind, next week we'll be in Lake Placid. So if you can make it, wonderful. We'd love to see you there. Thank you to Roost for having us come up to Lake Placid. Thank you to MMGY Global for their collaboration. And you can purchase the Vistas Latinas study to learn more about Hispanic travelers on their website, MMGY Global. And all of those net proceeds go to Travel Unity and our programs. Thank you to Thailand, Tourism Authority of Thailand. They are opening back up November 1st to vaccinated folks from specific countries. You can check more out about that. Thank you to our friends in Cayuga County and the Finger Lakes. Thank you to our sponsors, Rochester, New York, also in New York State, Fort Collins, Colorado, out there in Colorado, Legoland, New York, in Orange County, New York, North America Tour Hub. And thank you to CITA and the CITA Youth Foundation for supporting our youth summit up in the Adirondacks next week. Thank you to all of our partners and those who we work with on a general basis. Let me tell you a bit about Travel Unity in a deeper way than we've gone into previously. So, what makes Travel Unity different than initiatives and other entities? One big thing is we're a nonprofit. So inherently, we have a board that makes sure that what we do is in line with our mission of increasing diversity in the world of travel. It is all around the 501c3 aspect, which is a charitable, meaning that our goal in everything we do is how do we get underrepresented groups into the world of travel. A big part of our philosophy is that nobody's perfect, including us. You've seen it from me in various other sessions. Perfection is not a standard that I ever expect that I'm going to meet. It does not mean that I and we don't try, though. A big part of how we look at things is this concept of applied DEI, which you'll see in the theme of this year of DEI in action. It's not enough to make declaratory statements. It's not enough to aspire. You have to do the work. And that is inherently the core of what we're all about. On the other side of things too, though, we do not have a litmus or purity test for people. As long as you come to us with the idea that you believe travel should be for everyone with no exception, based on background or ability, we want to work with you. We want to talk to you. We want to have those dialogues. Everybody comes into this with bias. Everybody comes into this with different experiences. And as long as you come in with an open hand and a willing heart, we're happy to talk to you. Very important, and you've seen it over the past few days. When we talk about DEI, it is not a euphemism for race and ethnicity. It is that is a component of what we're talking about. But to pretend that there are not gay Black people or disabled Asian Americans makes somebody one thing when that's not the case. People have a variety of identities, and inherently they are more than just the one group perhaps you see them as, or the one community that they're most active in. People are a variety of things, and that is our focus. How people's concerns, needs, similarities, differences, how that all aligns with the different aspects of who they are. The other portion, when we talk about travel, we mean it as broadly as you can. We're not just talking about international trips. We're also talking about local and regional trips. We're talking about going to restaurants on the other side of town that you might have never been to. It's about cultural experiences. It's about going to state and national parks. It's even for us about going to a college or university that might not be where you grew up. We're talking about cultural exchange and new experiences. To that end, there's two main components to our work. On the individual side, it's mostly about youth. It's also about people with disabilities, but it really is, how do we get people to understand that travel can help them grow, be a part of who they are, and be a possible industry and career path. On the organizational side, it all goes through the filter of our DEI standards. So those standards have three pillars: management and workforce, visitorship, community impact. It's all the different ways that you can engage with human beings. So these are publicly available on our website. You never have to talk to us again. You could utilize those 90 pages of standards that are very intricate for you to figure out ways to incorporate DEI into the work that you do. Quickly, some of the services that we offer: do trainings and workshops to introduce folks to DEI, do audits to figure out how DEI is working or not working within an organization. And we also inherently look at travel as sometimes being in its own silo and separated from other folks. So we try to be that bridge with communities to translate between those different groups and the travel industry back and forth, and go, these are concerns, these are thoughts, this is what this is, and be that voice in between. We have 3 certificates. We have our TUS, which is our baseline certification. It's 6 hours at its core, where 3 of those hours are all around the travel industry, getting people to understand that. The other 3 are around DEI and getting people to understand how that fits into their lives and their professional lives. We have our leadership level certification, and that is a 6-session program that goes deeply into the different components of how you will incorporate DEI into an organization, and that culminates with a comprehensive DEI plan that is required to be vetted by Travel Unity for people to receive their certification. Finally, we have our organizational certification, which is all around how an organization demonstrates by us, a third party, that they're actually doing the things they're saying they're doing. I want to recognize and thank all the folks who are part of Travel Unity. As executive director, sometimes my face gets to be on more things than maybe it should be. Travel Unity is not just me, it's not just Romy, it's a lot of us. So our staff, our directors, our advisors, and I want to recognize all of them. You can find out more information on travelunity.org/team. They are a great group of people who make all of this work through their work and their expertise. We have our Travel Unity Alliance and our DEI working group, which are other ways that we engage with folks. I'm not going to go into this again, but if anybody wants to have that deeper connection with us, please reach out, and we'd love to have you as part of the Travel Unity Alliance. So now, this is our pledge, and this is our individual pledge. And the whole idea of this is really as a base point for how you can start thinking about DEI if you've never thought about it before, how you can start conceptualizing what this actually means, and really how do you make it personal to you, and not just about saying something once, but really incorporating it fully into your lives. And with that, I will kick things over to my colleague, Sophia Hyder Hock.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I should say, to be inclusive. It's wonderful to see everyone here today. So as Ronnie had mentioned, leading into the pledge, my other colleague and I, Kristin Lamoureux, will be talking about the pledge and really discussing the elements of what the pledge truly means. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so we can see it in greater depth. But I think it's also important as we talk through it, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. And then we'll also be asking questions. We want this to be a conversation to learn from each other, but also to ask questions that you may have about what the elements of the pledge mean. As we were, let me stop screen and I'll do it one more time. As we were talking about the pledge, Kristin and I were talking about how simple it seems like it's something that we all want to do and aspire to be, but in actuality, it can be a really hard thing to practice as a professional, as a visitor, and a community member. Kristin, would you like to add anything to any initial observations from our discussions that we've had?
I just want to start off by also welcoming everyone, saying thank you for coming, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think this conversation is one that maybe a lot of us are having internally or within our own groups is, what are the actions behind the intentions? And so hopefully this will lead to a good discussion today. And I don't think Sophia and I by any means are thinking we are experts in this. We are simply hoping to facilitate a conversation around this amongst all of us.
Absolutely. And we are, in my opinion, we're all works in progress here. So this is just as much of an exploration of how we seek understanding, how we can look at self-improvement and how to speak up, which is something that is a constant effort, conscious effort every day. So I'm going to delve right into the first part of the pledge, seeking understanding. I know that my life and views are shaped by my experience and the body that I inhabit. Others experience very different lives with different advantages and challenges. Initial thoughts on this, Kristin?
So, I mean, and again, there are basically three chunks, if you will, three major sections to the statement. So as we read these chunks, if you will, of the statement, if you have reactions, please let us know. But I think the first, and I don't even think it's the easiest, but it's certainly the first step, is the seeking understanding piece. And I think we've all had conversations either internally or with others where we're trying to we want to do the right thing, but we're even afraid to ask, and so I think getting out of our own head, understanding that, we don't necessarily understand, but trying everything, but we're seeking to understand better, and not putting that responsibility on others to teach us, but seeking to understand better is the first step.
And I think as a part of seeking understanding, this, in the context that I have experienced, is that it is a constant, it's a constant practice with everyone that we come in contact with. Everyone is different. Everyone has different backgrounds. And because we're human, and this is something that we're going to touch upon in session at 11, our brains typically try to protect us. And we try to make sure that our brains will always have that sense of fear, that fight or flight, to protect us, to ensure that we're safe. And so it is a normal behavior to judge someone right off the bat, and not initially try to seek understanding. So I think, at this part where we say it's hard to get out of your own head, it's because of what our brain usually does. So what's important, and what I try to do, is to realize that I've made a judgment and then say to myself, I need to first understand that I'm making assumptions, and I need to stop and either listen and not judge, because that's what my brain does. I think one more thing that I'd like to bring up, because it just happened this morning, was I've been trying to teach my 3-year-old these concepts of empathy and compassion and what these things mean. And I think about us as we are as adults, and the kind of concepts that we teach youth, the types of concepts we may teach, our kids if we have them, or nieces, or whoever else, nephews. And we try to do a job of breaking down these complex elements. And I always think about how adults can apply these concepts that we teach to ourselves. So this morning he asked me about empathy. And I thought, and then he's asked me about, what does culture mean? I was like, oh, this is a long conversation we're going to have. But it's really interesting to really think about what these concepts mean. Okay, I'm going to move on. So we touched a little bit upon this, seeking understanding, right? The easiest place is to start within. You can always do more, self-reflection. Sometimes it's not the easiest thing though, because we tend sometimes not to be vulnerable with ourselves. And so maybe recognizing that we can start with ourselves is a good place to start. That's the first thought that comes to my mind. Kristin, I want to ask you if anything resonates with you.
I think you've covered it. I know we're short on time, and I want to make sure we get to all of these points.
Mm-hmm. And I think one more thing that what we talked about yesterday is that there's an emphasis on bias. Bias can sometimes mean, just in our minds, we think about automatic negative biases. There are positive and negative biases, and it's really important to note that. Both can be helpful. They both can cause problems, of course, but it's really important to note that, again, there are positive biases that we can have and negative biases. It's not just a one-way negative street. In terms of self-exploration, it's a good idea, if you're trying to think about how to start within, to really think about aspects of your personal identity. So think about your life experiences, the education you've had, your surroundings, what you're interested in, personality traits, political values. You can start to really think about, as a starting point, where to start with some of your own experiences and what makes you who you are. And then it's also important to think about aspects of social identities. All this discussion about gender, the different types of genders, non-genders that exist. There's class, there's ability, age, sexual orientation, all these things that are constructs of a social identity that we also identify with. So it may seem like a lot, and it is, but it's a good place to start with, is just to start thinking about these things if you've never done it before.
And I think, as Sophia just mentioned in the previous a couple of slides ago, biases is something that we deal with all the time. There's no way to get away from that. And this conversation happened this week because Sophia was kind enough to come into my undergraduate class at a university and speak about unconscious bias to my students. And, for 20-year-olds to kind of be told you're biased, but, some of that could be positive, some of that could be negative. And then having them kind of understand, I think the hardest thing that we are dealing with is that you can't necessarily change your unconscious bias. You can work to be more aware of it, and you can make changes to how you react to situations. But all of this comes from a place of awareness building. So, you walk into a situation, you're judging someone. Failure to understand that that's a prejudgment or a judgment can lead to, a prejudice against someone. But there are also positive biases that we bring with us in every situation. So I think it's important as we think about bias and we talk about biases, understand that they are natural, and they do, as Sophia mentioned, help protect us and keep us safe in our brains. That's how our brains work. That's just human nature. So, what we do consciously to try to identify and build awareness, and then, mitigate if necessary our behaviors, is an ongoing process in the human brain.
Mm-hmm. And feel free, if you have any of your own thoughts, questions, comments, please place them in the chat, and we'll be sure to refer to them, or even raise your hand, as Ronnie has mentioned, in the chat as well. So there's some types of, this is just a few biases that exist. We wanted to provide you with some examples. Confirmation bias being one, trying to align your reality with some preconceptions. Maybe, I can think of a lot of different type of confirmation biases that exist. But in a confirmation bias, you're essentially have something in your mind and you're looking for associations to confirm what you're already thinking. So it may just not be what really is. Anchoring is when you're relying too much on one piece of information and you're using that one piece to make a decision, not really thinking, not taking into account maybe the 95% of other information that exists, but you're using that 5% to state your case. And then availability bias is thinking that something is more likely because you've heard about it recently. So you're thinking about maybe a piece of news that is stuck, and somehow it's it kind of all relates back to sometimes anchoring and confirmation bias. So a lot of them actually kind of relate to each other, and there are a few more here that we have, but it's really important. We present these different types of biases that you can see, so you are aware that they do exist, and there are different types. And we have not come up with the names, but others have. But it's again a tool for you to be aware that our brain is doing this all the time.
Does anyone have any questions or thoughts about this slide or the previous one about, this slide about the about types of bias on the previous slide? Any thoughts? And I think we can also talk. You can unmute yourself and talk.
Unmute yourself, absolutely.
If not, we can go on.
You can also send us private questions that we can ask as well if you don't feel comfortable. The other part of this pledge under the first kind of pillar is seeking understanding. I will listen to you and learn about others' experiences, especially where they differ from my own. And it goes back to empathy. And keeping an open mind. And there are a lot of nuances that go into listening to other people, their perspectives, being respectful, and also, as we have here, respectful curiosity. So go ahead, Kristin.
Yeah, I think this is one, I struggle with this because, I'm just, my personality type is I want to know things right away. And so if someone question, something presents to me that I don't understand, or maybe I haven't done something in the way that is appropriate, I want to know the answers right away. And it's part of my process, my evolution, is to not put it on others to explain it to me, but and know when the right time to ask the questions are, or just figuring it out myself, making it. And this is hard because I think, Sophia said, you very rarely go home and Google, what does a specific pronoun mean, or what's the history of this or that, in the moment, but it is our responsibility, I think, is trying to be more and growing to be more empathetic, that we think about this and not put the responsibility on others to explain it to us, which I think we've heard a lot in the news in the last year and a half about, putting the responsibility on others to explain to us, which isn't necessarily their situation. It's not their responsibility.
And this is, I think about the context of this all the time through different lenses, from a professional lens when, I've been asked questions, from a visitor and a community lens, when I want to learn about a different culture as well. And I think about, all the lenses that we have, from a professional lens, the visitor lens, like I mentioned, and a community lens. So I think it's a great thing to be curious and to want to learn. That's a way for us to, be able to connect more and to create an inclusive environment. But if you are curious about something and it just doesn't feel right, I did mention to Kristin about, the reality is that we won't go home and Google this up. But if there's something that you want to learn, maybe, jot it down if you don't understand it. Or you could, in a conversation, if it feels right, say, oh, I haven't heard that before. I'd like to learn more, and maybe leave it open-ended. And leaving an open-ended like that could offer, the person that's with you could say, oh, you should check this out. So you're not asking the person to explain, but they may offer up some resources or things to think about, than blatantly just, asking the person to explain themselves. And so I think it's good. It's a good thing to be curious. It's a good thing to open your mind to talking to different people, learning about different perspectives. But it's also really important to take it upon yourself to do the research or do your homework. As I do diversity, equity, inclusion work throughout every day of my life. It's my job, and I'm realizing that there's so much that I still don't know, and so I try to take time to do the research too, to be respectful of other people's identities and their time as well.
That's a great segue into the next section, or the next pillar, which speaks to self-improvement. And just a reminder, that portion of the pillar, or this pillar, says, I know that people can stumble when talking to others who live in different circumstances. I accept that I will make mistakes, and so will others. I will do the work to learn from my mistakes and those of others. So this is our second pillar of the individual Travel Unity Pledge. And I think this is one that we can all kind of understand, right? No one is perfect. We'll all make mistakes. But I think this idea of intent, I just read a really interesting book about habit building. And one of the things that they said was, unless you write something down, doesn't matter whether you have the best intentions, unless you write it down and commit to it every single day, you're not actually going to change or create a habit, right? And this is, on a different topic, but I think this is where we have a lot of us, myself included, intent. We want to do the right thing, but there has to be a commitment, or there should be a commitment to going to that next level of actually putting in place the action steps to make those changes. And you won't always agree with everyone, and not everyone within even your own identity group sees things the same way. But humility, being humble, willing to learn from others is a big part of making those tiny action steps, or those action steps that are going to get us to greater empathy.
I think the other thing about self-improvement, even though we talk about self, is recognizing that we can't make assumptions about other people. And that's, again, just who we are. We make assumptions, we put a meaning to an assumption, and then somehow we internalize that. And so it's really important to recognize that that we're doing that, and that being able to be humble if we can, and willing to be open to learn, is a skill set that is hard to practice, but it's something that we can consciously remind ourselves of every day, and it's always a work in progress. So if you can commit to have the intent to being humble, maybe that's a good start. Some other aspects, as we think about self-reflection, is how we can improve the way we think by thinking about the actions that we have as humans. So sometimes when we do make assumptions about people, we are othering them, and we're making them kind of feel like they don't belong because they don't really fit into an aspect of the identity that you have in mind for them, right? So there's that assumption that we're making. Oh, they don't belong. We're automatically othering them. There's a term called erasure, where we just, kind of exclude a marginalized group, really not thinking about the history that exists as it even really existing. Microaggressions are a big one that we've talked about. Kristin and I have talked about quite a bit, and we'll get into that in a moment. And then pronouns are something that has, I think, been in existence for quite a while, but I think has really been in the mainstream discussion and existence probably over the past maybe year or two. And the fact that people have different pronouns, that we can now see in the Zoom calls or in emails. LinkedIn has it. And so a part of all these things that we bring up is to recognize, again, that we may be doing them. We may not understand pronouns for an example, as an example, but we can do the research to understand where that pronoun originates, where it comes from, so then we can do a little more self-reflection to respect that person's identity. Just an example. Kristin, did you want to touch upon microaggressions, because we brought that up quite a bit yesterday?
Yeah, microaggressions are just such an interesting area, because the more you think about it, and the more you think about your day-to-day experiences, you're probably going to be able to reflect upon microaggressions that are happening to you, or maybe even that you're doing to others, more than you realize, And so I think quite often, I think historically microaggressions have been not as easily identified. Now that there's greater awareness, we're starting to see more awareness about this in the workplace and others. And I'll use an example that the research, we've seen research that says that there are microaggressions against women in the workplace at a greater level than by men and women than against men, and so you have to start to think about, even if this isn't a microaggression, even if it's not something that's happening to you, are you seeing this? And how are you reacting to others being the recipients of microaggression? And what is your responsibility? This is such a broad topic, and one that I think is so has been ignored for a long time, and something that we really need to be focusing on. And what are our responsibilities towards others when we're seeing this microaggression towards others? And we're going to talk a little bit about what do you do when you see anything in just a second. Sophia, did I miss something we talked about?
No, I think you covered it. I think the one thing I encourage you to do is, maybe think about any microaggressions that you have experienced, and think about how they have impacted you or made you feel. And then just think about your reaction to that. Maybe, how did you react to it? Did you say something? Did you not say something? Maybe next time when we think about, acting upon something, how you would like to express the level of uncomfortableness that you may have felt. So it's good to kind of think about these things as a way to self-reflect.
And I think one of the things that, we all, so let's just, Sophia and I were discussing, I want to call them almost unconscious microaggressions. So, many of us have had experiences where you traveling abroad, you check into a hotel, or you're doing a project or working, and the first question is, well, I get this question all the time when I'm working abroad. I work abroad a lot, and the question I get a lot in certain cultures, so certain communities, is, does your husband mind? Your husband lets you travel by yourself. They ask me, doesn't your husband mind? Or you're so lucky that your husband lets you travel by yourself. And, I can be offended. I mean, I have to take that in the cultural context of where I am. But there are times where things are said where, my response is probably a snarky response, some sort of sarcastic or snarky response. Certainly not when it's, when I understand the culture, but, in other contexts. And I want personally to get better at trying to make sure that my response doesn't make the problem worse, or doesn't, give cause for more anger, or more lack of understanding. And I think this is hard, because we're kind of faced with things, and my background, my family, et cetera, they're very sarcastic people. I grew up in a community that sarcasm was kind of the norm, and so my response to anything like this is usually to find some sarcastic, maybe I think funny situation. But how can I respond to this better in not a snarky way, but in an informative way that maybe leads to growth for both of us?
Absolutely. And every context, every situation is different. And it's really important to note that. So whatever decision you make should be done with intent, because again, no two situations are the same. So in the context of a microaggression, if we're going to talk about that, or really any type of bias that we've maybe that we've offended someone in the context of a situation, I think it's important to be open to understanding why the situation is offensive, because you may just not understand. And so to be open to hear that perspective is really important to growth. And while intent, isn't enough, you may have had good intentions by saying something. It's still important to realize that the other person was offended for, some reason. But to listen to that could be a little vulnerable, could be a little hard, but that's where the growth takes place. speaking up. This is the last part of the pillar, but also can be the, one of the hardest. I think all three of these are really hard to do. So speaking up, I will be constructively vocal when I see inequities, especially when I'm coming from a place of privilege that will amplify my voice. Before I move on into some tips, did you want to say anything yet about this, Kristin?
I mean, I think this is hard, and I think we've all experienced this. And so I know that, many of us probably on the East Coast or here in the those that are in the United States saw the news last week of, this horrible case in Philadelphia where a woman was sexually assaulted on a train, I believe it was, while other people were on the train. And some people were, taking pictures, but no one intervened to help this woman. And I think we all looked at that in horror. How could that possibly happen? If I had been on the train, I would have intervened, right? So, ironically, just last week, someone I care about deeply, someone who is extremely empathetic, in my opinion, was on a train, and a similar, not in any way as severe, but a similar situation was happening where there was one person being very vocal and being abusive vocally to others on the train, to women on the train. And eventually, this particular person wanted to intervene, but was concerned about their own safety. And, they're on a train and, there's nowhere to go if someone starts to attack you or something. And so someone eventually did intervene, and that didn't work out all that well for the person that intervened, but whatever. And so we had this conversation just last week about what should he have done in that situation. And then here we have this case in Philadelphia that's just horrific. And so when you see these things, it's such a challenge to know what to do to put your own your own safety, first maybe, or not, depending on, what you want to do. I think this is something that we're all challenged with, but I would love to hear any thoughts on this. Sophia and I have, have come up with some steps, or these are steps that are recommended by professionals. But I know this is one we all struggle with. So if you have any thoughts, please feel free to put it in the chat. But, or just speak up.
And to that, there are also, we're talking about aligning, speaking up, this pledge with the pillars. There are 3 different ways to look at it. So there's the professional lens in speaking up in the context of a boardroom or a meeting. That context of speaking up is different than being in a destination, being a visitor. And it's also different in this sense that I think your example, Kristin, is a community member,
right?
Perspective. So we have different ways, different situations that we're put in that deal with this pledge and how to be a more inclusive role model. But there are different ways to speak up, and different ways to.
Well, and I think a famous case was in a that I had read about in Time magazine, which I mentioned in my classes all the time, was the first term of President Obama's, and maybe some of you have heard this, but the first term of President Obama's administration, there was, several women, very strong, Hillary Clinton being one of them, strong women on his cabinet, and they were challenged with having their opinions heard in cabinet meetings. So much so that they actually had, according to this article, they came up with a system to support each other in, echoing. When one woman said something that, was important or needed to be heard, the other women on the cabinet would echo it. And, this article, I don't know if this is true, but what the article said was that President Obama actually recognized that they were doing this, and so developed a system to ensure that women's voices in his cabinet were heard, with the same seriousness or attention as male voices. I mean, that's an example that was in the mainstream press, and I don't know all of the details about it as far as what really happened, but I think this is a perfect example at the highest level how this is happening. And of course, it had a happy solution, but this is something that, you know, we are seeing needs to be, yeah. So thank you for the, Ronnie shared the one of the articles about this. I think Lavanya, and I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, has a question.
Yes.
Lavanya?
Yes. Hi, Kristin and Sophia. I'm sorry, I'm not using my video. It's too early for me. I'm okay, so this is, I have a really hard and easy time at the same time. I have no problem speaking up, but I just wish that in the travel industry in general, that just like the women in the Obama administration, if there was a way that organizations like Travel Unity and SHEW could help somebody who wants to speak up. Like, for instance, I recently had a question, or wanted to share something about the cruise industry, and I reached out to this particular cruise line and I haven't heard back, and about discrimination and such. And again, I feel like just one person speaking up is not going to make a difference. So how can we get together, and even as a Travel Unity or SHEW or other organizations, to say let's discuss this and let's help each other with speaking up. In the past, I've heard excuses like, oh, we're not here to police them, or we're not here to do such and such. So I feel like I'm alone in this. So what advice do you have for that?
I think that that's an excellent point. I myself belong to two groups that have grown out of professional groups that have grown out of the need to amplify a voice. So I mean, I think Ronnie posted, where Travel Unity is definitely trying to play that role and keep growing in that role. I think a lot of industry associations are, well, I think industry associations are also a place where, if one particular member of an industry or a sub-industry isn't paying attention, maybe the industry association. But I would also encourage you to seek out or even form, if needed, your subgroup of amplifying voices. And I'll give you one example. There's an organization that focuses on destination management organizations in the United States, or internationally. And I know of a subgroup within that are senior leaders working to support each other and amplify each other's voice. So, Sophia and I are members of a group in the Washington, D.C. area of women in the travel space that are seeking to amplify and connect, because it's not just amplify. Sometimes it's as much about the mentorship and the connections. As soon as you said cruise lines, I'm thinking in the back of my head, well, I know somebody at CLIA that I could, connect her to, the Cruise Line Industry Association. So, I mean, I think building, working and continuing, Travel Unity definitely wants to play this role, but continuing to work in your own networks to seek out, how you can support each other is important. Sophia or Ronnie?
I completely agree with you. I know how I completely empathize on how you feel, Lavanya, and I think that the hardest part is to say it out loud and to speak up just like you did. And so by saying it out loud now, I personally am thinking about all the things that Travel Unity can do to be able to amplify a voice, but to have this hold space for this discussion. And so if you've brought this up, it's not just you that's thinking this. I guarantee a lot more people that are feeling that way, but have not spoken up to say something. So I think that it's something that Travel Unity has, as Ronnie says right here, is that, we'd love to see a TU SHEW collaboration on how to be able to amplify voices, but also create that connection to have these discussions on this problem exists, then what can we do? Like, what can we actually do? And so I think it starts right here. of this idea that you brought up, and we can take this idea and we can develop it into holding more discussions about how we can make this a space for discussion and action. So you've been heard, your voice has been heard. And I know Ronnie has heard it because he's typing a lot of things in the chat right now. Absolutely.
Sophia, I think we skipped one.
I think we did too. That's why I'm going back to it.
It was the 5 steps, the 5 Ds, if you will, of bystander intervention when you do see a situation unfold. Or I won't say steps because it's not one after the other, it's options.
Mm-hmm. This is the one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I
okay.
think that's where we were.
So here are some ways to think about. Yes, thank you for providing the resource, Ronnie, in the chat. So bystander information intervention and how to be able to think about, another way of speaking up. Distracting. So if there's a situation that takes place, this distracting is a way to be able to, I think from a safety point of view, to use to then, if I'm thinking of, honestly, I look at these and I think about my mama bear hat and safety is what I think about. I want to give credit to bystander intervention that comes from Hollaback. And Ronnie put that in the chat as well. So I think about that from a safety standpoint. If there's a situation that occurs, being able to distract, if you're in that situation, distracting the person so you could either get help, delegating a response to someone else to get help. This is the way I see it.
Yeah, and so, I really do want to call out Hollaback because they have some great graphics on their website and everything about these 5 Ds. I think the delegate one, if you're in a public space, is so important, especially if you're in a store or something where you can bring other people into the conversation, or you're in an office building. I mean, it doesn't have to be a person of, law enforcement or security. It could be a clerk, excuse me, this person is being harassed. Can you help, or something similar. I mean, this is sometimes I call it like the collaborative. You're bringing more people into the problem, which hopefully is going to diffuse or at least give the harasser less power. But again, that's in a personal way. In an office situation, who are you delegating? We often think about HR as being part of the delegation team, but who are you delegating? You're sharing the responsibility of intervention is the way I see this.
And then with documenting, if we again think about our brain and we think about how our brain reacts, there are going to be a lot of things that we are going to forget, any of the detail that we need to know. So if we can, in a moment, being able to really think about some details that are important to a situation, so you can kind of have them, as opposed to having our brain usually just forgetting a lot of different steps in the moment. Being able to capture some of what's taking place is a helpful way to be able to help with the situation.
And I think on delay, this is the reaction, the situation has passed, but and maybe there wasn't an intervention during the situation, but you're checking in with that person afterwards, checking if they need to be accompanied somewhere, or if they want to talk, or just let them know that you can empathize, or you're aware of their situation.
And the last one is directing. So understanding a space, a situation, and maybe trying to help direct people away from a situation or a place to safety as best possible. Again, all depending upon the context of a situation, whether you're in. Yeah, right. Whether in your professional setting, whether it's a visitor setting, and again, that community lens. Again, I want to give credit to Hollaback for their bystander resources. Now, as we wrap up the session, just some final thoughts as we've provided you with a lot to think about today. Is that it's really important to try the best that you can to be respectful, but also to be curious, respectful curiosity. And we all go through life with different similarities, with differences, and our own, our own journey, our own life path. Someone's experiences and their preferences can obviously be different than yours, and we have to be able to be open and to take that into account. And if we do make initial assumptions, like we do as humans, it's to have that open mind and to be open to changing your mind, noticing that you did have an initial assumption about someone, a judgment, is where growth takes place, recognizing that it actually happened. I'll let Kristin take the last one because it's a big one that we've just talked about.
Yeah, I mean, again, speaking up doesn't have to happen at the exact moment that something happens. I see this a lot with young people that I work with. And one of the direction I always give young people that come to me is we need to listen to each other. I find that with the screen time that we're all literally involved in right now, but through most of our day, sometimes our check-ins are somewhat superficial. We think we're engaged, we think we're checking in, but we aren't necessarily checking in or speaking up or whatever it might be with people in the way that they need, that is meaningful. I've read a really interesting article on mental health recently where it talked about understanding that the level of engagement is not an indicator of how someone actually is doing. As a matter of fact, it might be counterintuitive, that the people that are very engaged might actually be on the verge of burnout or a breakdown, not, at various different levels. So I think, one of the most important steps in all of this is understanding, or just to sum up, reflecting back on yourself, but also in being sure that you are checking in with others and being that, I hate to use the word ally, but being, because I think it's overused, the media uses that a lot, but being empathetic about other people's situations and going beyond just an intention to an action.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So again, we thank you for being here in the session today and encourage you to revisit that individual pledge and think about your role, think about the impact that you have, and think about it from the context of, again, professional setting, when you travel and you're a visitor, and also as a community member, because this work is constant. And there's always room for growth, and you do have support, and you do have a voice.